My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm working on wrapping up my dissertation, hopefully going to defend on July 19th if I can find a substitute for the one member of my committee who got a big gig over on the other side of the country. So I'm hoping that all works out. So today is going to be a little weird. I'm trying out a new feature on Twitter, but I'm not going to start that until a little bit later. I wanted to talk about two things, which you can sort of see up here. The first is a pretty amazing discovery that was made by a group. Well, it's a collaboration, but largely based in Melbourne, Australia, Melbourne. And it has to do with autism. And so autism is a variable condition, and there have been many genes that have been implicated in the development of autism. And there happen to be, some of these genes happen to be both active in both the brain and in the gut. And so as Elisa Hill-Yardine, I believe is how you might pronounce her name, says, quote, "We know that the brain and gut share many of the same neurons, and now, for the first time, we've confirmed that they also share some autism-related gene mutations. Up to 90% of people with autism suffer from gut issues." Side note, I didn't know that. Back to the quote, "Which can have a significant impact on daily life for them and their families, and our findings suggest these gastrointestinal problems may stem from the same mutations in genes that are responsible for diet and behavioral issues in autism." And so that's pretty exciting. There's something that there are specific genes, which, by the way, we'll talk about their sort of history in just a second, that are implicated in both the gut and the brain. And when we talk about the history of the research of these genes, back in 2003, there was a group based out of Sweden and France, if I remember correctly, who studied two brothers, both of whom had autism. And this work was the first to tie specific genes to autism. So again, this is in 2003, so over 10 years ago. And so they highlighted genes that encode something, a family of proteins called neuroligands. And so the abbreviation for these genes is often NLG or NLGN, and then in specific it's NLGN3 and NLGN4. And what neuroligands do, they're called cell adhesion proteins that kind of act as scaffolding, is oftentimes the word that's used in biomedical science, but basically like a bridge between components of a synapse. A synapse, of course, is the point of communication between two or more neurons. And so you have a presynaptic and postsynaptic density. The presynaptic is where the signal is coming from. Postsynaptic is what's receiving the signal. And oftentimes when we talk about like neurotransmitter or drug binding receptors, we oftentimes use this heuristic called the lock and key model, which basically describes how these neurotransmitters and drugs bind their receptors. And so neuroligands and another type of protein, their sort of partner called neurexins, are oftentimes described as proteins that are shaking hands to connect both sides of that synapse, the pre and post synaptic densities. Some also sometimes describe it as describe this interaction between neuroligands and neurexins as acting like Velcro. And so while doing this research, again, back in 2003, this Swedish and French team studying these two brothers who were being evaluated, also, they noted that apart from, or in addition to, symptoms of autism, they also seem to have significant gastrointestinal problems. Very interesting, right? And so this team in Australia found that the mutations in these genes, the neuroligand genes, for the first time, or one of the first times, have been implicated in multiple GI processes. And so just to give you an idea of kind of some of the research that is done to show that these things interact, if you can see sort of in this corner here, and don't worry about all the abbreviations up there. Basically, blue is neurexin, green is neuroligand, and as you can see, they just sort of attach some fluorescent colors to both of those proteins. And so as you can see, the green neuroligand will form a connection, or will sort of communicate with any cell. In this case, it's actually a kidney cell, but neurons certainly as well. And you can sort of see where the green is kind of invading that blue signal. And those are theoretically in the brain, they would be points of synaptic communication. And so this group, again in Australia, in Melbourne, found that in animals that had mutations in these genes, again, they had gastrointestinal issues. And so some of the things that they identified were that the mutations in these genes caused increased numbers of neurons in the small intestine. And this, in addition to that, they had altered motility, or just the speed at which food moved through the small intestine compared to animals that do not have these mutations. Also, they had changed activity of a neurotransmitter that we've long known was active in the brain, and it's less characterized in the gut, nitrogen monoxide. So, NO. And so, or nitric oxide, right? This is not the same thing as nitrous oxide or NOS or laughing gas. That's dinitrogen monoxide. We're talking about nitrogen monoxide. Just one nitrogen and one oxygen. And then finally, they also showed that there was increased sensitivity of a particular kind of GABA receptor called the GABA A. You might be familiar with a category of drugs called the benzodiazepines like Valium or diazepam, Xanax or alprazolam. These are drugs that bind and increase the activity, sensitivity of GABA A receptors. And so despite the fact that the GABA A subtype of GABA receptors aren't particularly dense in the gastrointestinal system, people with autism are oftentimes prescribed medications that specifically influence the activity of GABA A receptors. And so there may be effects of medications on the GI system that have yet to be characterized in folks with autism that may either exacerbate or ameliorate some of the symptoms, the gastrointestinal systems that folks with autism can experience. And so in addition to this neuroligin connection, right, again, important for both the brain and the gut, another similar kind of protein called SHANK3 has been probably one of the most widely characterized association with autism. It's a similar kind of like scaffolding protein that kind of like hooks things like neurotransmitter receptors or ion channels, or basically any protein, many proteins in the membranes of neurons. And so no surprise there, right? Similar to neuroligin, which kind of associate synaptic densities, helping to keep synapses together, SHANK3 helps to sort of keep things in the neuron, or I should say in the neuronal membrane, again, like neurotransmitter receptors. And so that has sort of predictable consequences or anticipated consequences for the architecture of the brain. But a recent group, also in Melbourne, found that animals with mutations in SHANK3 also exhibit gastrointestinal differences, and in particular in microbial populations that inhabit the gut. And so, you might be familiar if you have, pay attention to kind of recent discoveries in biomedical science. The microbiome has been getting a lot of attention. And the microbiome, you can think of it, oh, here, I think I have a fun little picture. Yeah, you can sort of think of it as sort of like how fish inhabit a coral reef. They're not part of the coral reef. They live in the coral reef, but the coral reef itself is alive. It's, the product of a living organism. Similarly, your gut hosts the existence of many, many different kinds of microbial populations. Everybody has slightly different compositions, different populations of those microbes. And so it turns out that if, mice are raised in identical environments, identical food, if they have mutations in SHANK3, and in this case only, everything else was controlled, they also showed that there were changes in things like amino acids and short chain fatty acids and various sort of metabolism-related molecules as a byproduct of this mutation in SHANK3. Again, implicating a relationship between changes in the gut, symptoms in the gut among folks with autism, and the more widely or more broadly characterized changes in the brain. So very exciting. This, I believe, is the first team that has directly shown a common mutation that affects or that influences both symptoms that are associated with the brain and the gut in folks with autism. So very cool work. Now, on to MDMA and PTSD. And so MDMA has recently been getting a lot of attention for its potential application in psychiatric settings. And this has been somewhat controversial among some communities, not these days, not so much the biomedical community, but most of that controversy is attributed to the fact that MDMA, also known as ecstasy or more recently Molly, has been widely used in kind of recreational settings. It sort of became particularly popular sort of in the mid-90s in the kind of underground rave or dance scene. And so as a result, it was sort of relegated to this just abused drug that's potentially dangerous. It led to legislation in the United States called the RAVE Act that empowered the DEA to emergency schedule a drug because it's such a threat to the population that they need to just sidestep the whole FDA process or congressional legislation to control this potential menace, right? Or this realized menace. Now, that is a very debatable. The justification for that is, I think, highly debatable. But regardless, as a result of that, MDMA has existed in this kind of, category of drugs of ill repute, right? However, ever since then, there has been a kind of a contingent of biomedical scientists and psychiatrists who've recognized that it might have some potential application in clinical settings. And over the recent years, clinical trials have suggested that it may indeed be quite effective in the treatment of PTSD, if not other psychiatric conditions as well. And so this was a group at the University of British Columbia, and they published this report in Psychopharmacology, a journal called Psychopharmacology. And so, it's important to step back and recognize how significant of an issue PTSD is. About 4% of people worldwide suffer from PTSD throughout their life at some point, and it's debilitating. It implicates everything from anxiety, social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, symptoms that would be recognized in those conditions, but also things like depression, avoidance, just in general. Social isolation, it affects sleep, and then, of course, perhaps most problematically, suicidality, meaning, either having suicidal thoughts or attempting suicide. And in the United States, rates of suicide has been increasing quite alarmingly over the past few years. And so I wanted, we talk about MDMA, and oftentimes talk about drugs without putting them in a kind of pharmacological context. And so I know the colors here are not optimal, but you can see MDMA at the top. Here, I'll put my hands here so you can see that Furin ring. But if you compare MDMA, the structure of MDMA, to a neurotransmitter with which you might be familiar called dopamine, you can see that there are some significant similarities. The primary differences being the presence of these hydroxyl groups rather than this dioxylane ring, and then also the addition of a methyl group here connected to the amine, as well as another methyl at the end of that chain. And so, MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. So it is an analog of methamphetamine, or just an analog of amphetamine, but due to the presence of that dioxylane ring, it has slightly different pharmacology. Actually, substantially different pharmacology, I should say, having much greater effects on serotonergic signaling. So back to this group in Melbourne. So this team saw improvements in patients who diagnosed with PTSD who had not responded to any other treatments. And so Zach Walsh, who is an associate professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, says, quote, PTSD symptoms decreased after one session of MDMA together with psychotherapy. And then after that, this isn't a quote, but he added that 54% of participants no longer would have met the criteria to be diagnosed with PTSD after only 2 sessions, which is pretty remarkable. And so this study compared folks who were treated with, let's say, a full dose of MDMA to other participants in the study who either were given lower doses of MDMA, seeing if the dose makes a significant difference in how people respond, or solely psychotherapy, where participants didn't receive any MDMA. And it showed that this MDMA, let's say full dose treatment group, responded the best. And so sort of excitingly, there will be 2 more upcoming full-blown clinical trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And so the first of them has already started recruiting. It actually began in November of 2018, last November. And their goal is to recruit between 100 and 150 participants across 15 different sites or cities in the United States, Canada, and Israel, interestingly. And then there will be a second clinical trial that is intended to begin after a period of of preliminary evaluation of the data derived from this first study, and that second study will recruit an additional 100 to 150 participants. And then in addition to those clinical trials, we can expect some in Europe conducted by independent groups to begin pretty soon. So pretty exciting news, particularly for folks who are suffering from PTSD for whom no treatment has been successful. And then I wanted to touch on this other paper. I don't have any prepared. Oh, wait, actually, I might. Yeah, I do, actually. Okay, let's see. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So you might be wondering why there's this boring textbook illustration on the screen here. Well, let me get to that. Okay, so this group at Rockefeller University, which is in New York City, New York State, has been working on developing a category of new molecules that might be able to treat autoimmune disorders specifically. And so this is the Tuschl lab. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but they have developed a class of small molecules that inhibit one of the primary enzymes that is implicated in autoimmune responses very broadly. And so this enzyme is called GMP-AMP synthase, or CGAS. So it is essentially an enzyme that is activated by and binds DNA. It's sort of wayward, right? It's sort of floating around in the cytosol, that's generally speaking not where DNA tends to accumulate. Sometimes it can, but generally speaking, it's not supposed to be there, right? And so the immune system kind of kicks into gear and activates various pathways to ensure that it's destroyed. But DNA in the cytosol isn't universally always categorically a sign that there's an infection. And sometimes DNA just sort of ends up in the cytosol rather than getting sequestered in places like the nucleus or mitochondria, and other organelles. And so importantly, though, this enzyme doesn't distinguish between DNA that's like supposed to be there versus DNA that might be derived from a DNA-based virus like the herpes virus or like smallpox. It may or may not be one of those viruses, or it could just be your own DNA that's completely innocuous. So the team started out with a library of 300,000 candidate molecules using a technique called high throughput screening. Sequencing is a slightly different thing, to see if some of the members of this 300,000 candidate library might be able to kind of calm down CGAS. Again, that enzyme that recognizes DNA in the cytosol no matter where it's from. And they winnowed it down to 2 candidates. And then, which is oftentimes what happens with this kind of drug development, they kind of improvised a bit on the molecular structure to see if they could make a structure that had even better activity in inhibiting CGAS. And again, that's the enzyme that detects this, wayward DNA in the cytosol. So they found some, and they are going to be testing them on a specific rare genetic disease called Aicardi-Goutier. It's a French term. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And basically, it's sort of like the ideal disease model for them because this condition arises from abnormal levels of DNA accumulating in the cytosol. Perfect. Which then activates CGAS, which has a bunch of downstream consequences as a result. And so Professor Tuschl, again at Rockefeller University, says, quote, "This class of drug could potentially be used to treat more common diseases such as systemic lupus and possibly other neurodegenerative diseases that include some kind of inflammatory contribution such as Parkinson's disease." And then I would add, Alzheimer's disease. That's the end of his quote, but Alzheimer's disease. There are various types of dementia also implicate just inflammatory processes, and so that treatment with a molecule like this might be able to mitigate some of the damage induced by just the inflammatory responses to, the aberrant accumulations of things like Lewy bodies in Parkinson's disease, or amyloid beta plaques or neurofibrillary tangles in Alzheimer's disease, and so on. So that's pretty exciting, and of course there are many autoimmune diseases that perhaps multiple sclerosis. Who knows that if a pathway like this might be able to be inhibited to prevent the immune system from recognizing, from beginning, having the dominoes begin to fall, and then in that cascade of autoimmune disease. So yeah, interesting studies. I wish I had prepared them a little bit more before I started. I didn't have quite enough time, but I'm going to keep doing it this way, where I talk about, hopefully 3, if not more, specific studies that have come out in like the past week or 2 weeks, and just kind of go through them. I think, there's so much research that's active throughout the world now, that pretty much every week there's something really remarkable that's worth, taking note. Because I think oftentimes as people outside of biomedical science, your only point of contact with biomedical science is through your physician. And of course, most of this research won't necessarily yield any kind of treatment that your physician would even know about for 5 years, 10 years, though that specific problem is also trying to be solved at the sort of regulatory level. But anyways, that's the goal. Okay, so now I'm going to start on Twitter, and I'm trying this new system that they have just via the Twitter app. So if you'll forgive a little awkward vamping while I get this all ready. I also don't know if this is going to work because it's kind of a new feature that they're testing out. Okay, that's the back of the camera. And I believe we should be... okay, guests on. Okay, excellent. No, not St. Louis versus Philly. What? Kaboom. Okie dokie. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. And I am in the last finishing stretch of my PhD, hoping to defend on July 19th, although I'm going to have to replace a committee member that had been on my committee since the beginning, and she was very awesome. She brought a lot of sort of human research insights to my work, which is always very helpful. And July 19th is not that far away from now. And so that is causing me a little bit of stress, not as much sleep as I would like to have. Then what? Oh, Jans. Well, we shall see. There are a couple labs that I would be interested in potentially doing a postdoc, but I'm kind of interested in expanding my methodological horizons, right? I do a lot of like viral work. Some people call it like circuit tracing, where I get very, very nitty-gritty on specific neuronal populations that communicate with other specific neuronal populations, which is very, very basic neuroscience. It's extremely exciting to me, but I would like to have a little bit more of a clinical exposure and a little bit more human research exposure. But it's tough. It's extraordinarily competitive, and since I don't really have those skills, that's a lot of like computer programming. It's tough to sell myself. Either that, or I'm interested in also, there's a lot of, I think, opportunities for the relationship between the federal government, its funding of basic biomedical research, and so potentially going into that kind of work I think would be very exciting for me. So thanks for asking. Okay, what is the cause of male pattern baldness and receding hair on males? Does it have to deal with diet? Lay back, Dre. Well, I feel your pain if you can't tell. A lot of males will ultimately experience at least some balding, if not just go completely bald. It's essentially genetic. It has to do with the activity of an enzyme that converts testosterone into another form, DHT, which essentially attacks hair follicles, or it engages hair follicles in such a way as to interfere with the kind of growth cycle that hair undergoes. And to the extent that diet or lifestyle, all of those things will influence your endocrine system in one way or another, either by affecting, how much testosterone you're producing. But generally speaking, if you have the genetics to undergo some balding, it's essentially just going to happen. If it's any consolation, there's a lot of research into understanding the biology of how hair grows, not necessarily exclusively for cosmetic reasons, but also for cosmetic reasons. And so there might be some interesting opportunities using things like stem cells to interfere with that enzymatic interaction. All right, it's totally normal, totally normal. What happens in the brain when one has an orgasm? North Queen, super interesting topic. In fact, I think people relegate orgasm or sexual arousal to this category of like not being serious, but it is kind of like one of the central aspects of the human experience, right? I mean, it's literally thus the solution that human evolution came up with to motivating us to engage in reproductive behaviors, right? And engage in behaviors that don't necessarily directly benefit our own survival. I mean, it's not like having kids will enable you to live longer necessarily, but there's some interesting anthropological research on that. But yeah, it's sort of like the invisible hand of natural selection or evolution by natural selection to motivate us to engage in those behaviors. And what's interesting about orgasm is that it's poorly understood at a neurophysiological level, though essentially all the characterizations that I've seen in trying to understand the neurobiology of orgasm is that it's largely it's a byproduct of activity in a division of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. And so this is a division of the nervous system that's largely active only when you're not being drawn into focusing on something in your environment. In other words, your sympathetic nervous system is not active. And it involves a lot of signaling not within the brain, but rather within the spinal cord. I remember I took down some notes because like a lot of these brain regions aren't among the ones that I study the most. So my research focuses on addiction and more broadly mood through the lens of addiction, right? Addiction is a condition, a psychobehavioral, psychobiobehavioral, I think is what the term that a former director of NIDA, Alan Leshner, said, which is like psycho-bio-behavioral. It's like everything that humans do, it's a byproduct of that. So I studied that. But of course, a lot of mood-related brain regions are involved in orgasm and sexual arousal. And so, we're talking about regions of the brain that are very primitive, you might say, and that term isn't used to denigrate these regions. Rather, these are parts of the brain that have been present in essentially, so many of our ancestors over the course of our evolution that they've just been there since the beginning. And so we're talking about various regions of the thalamus, and then the sensory cortex, of course, where it's a part of our cortex that's sort of like right here, sort of that. Is what enables us to be sensitive to various sensory stimuli throughout our body. And, of course, touch, physical touch is very important to instigating an orgasm. And so signals after arriving at the somatosensory cortex are then sent to other very old parts of the brain, like the hippocampus and the amygdala, and then meet at an area of the brain called the medial preoptic area, which is a part of the brain that I study sort of tangentially, and various hypothalamic nuclei. And this whole pathway is something that we call the telodiencephalic reproductive complex. So that's one of those terms that we use to just sort of like say a giant circuit within the brain. But then eventually it makes it out into the periphery through the spinal cord, touching or passing through the periaqueductal gray or PAG beforehand, and then eventually arriving to a part of the spinal cord called the lumbosacral neurons that are basically sort of like towards what's important for an orgasm, that part of your body, which then mediates the output of those signals. So it's basically this collaboration between central nervous system regions in the brain, as well as parasympathetic ganglia, again, that division of the nervous system that's devoted to when you're sort of relaxed, you're not being aroused by anything in your environment apart from one very specific thing, obviously, to then mediate the output of an orgasm. Yeah. Hey, what's up, Scott? Good to see you, Euro Maestro. Lovely to see you here. Hope all is well. Okay, so Euromaestro loves to bring up topics that I think he knows that I don't have anything insightful to say, but it's all the more fun for it. So why does the predictive mass of a quantum vacuum have little effect on the expansion of the universe? I would recommend you talk to a physicist if you're interested in that. But yeah, no insights for you. Sorry, Euro. You know as much as I do. How do I grow a beard? Well, much like male pattern baldness and balding in general is essentially, by the way, the girls just got home. So if you hear any lovely chatter, that is my baby talking to her mother. So it's essentially genetically determined, right? It's like the distribution of hair follicles, the density of hair follicles. Obviously, generally speaking, you have to have hit puberty or have surpassed puberty by a while to begin testosterone mediating the growth of all that facial hair. But apart from, and actually, I've read recently that people are actually getting kind of hair transplants to thicken their beard, which is pretty wild. But yeah, largely or essentially genetic. And so just like some people, their beard does grow in, like in here. Some people don't. Genetically determined. It's not like I played football and baseball when I was a teenager, and that had X, Y, or Z effect, and so therefore I don't have hair in those regions. So, will magic mushrooms actually help PTSD? Well, Detroit Rock City. Awesome topic. A little bit earlier on YouTube, I talked about a very recent study that came out. That another one that evaluated MDMA for its potential application in the treatment of PTSD. And so I won't go into all, the entire depth. Again, that's on YouTube if you're interested in it. But basically, this was a group at, University of British Columbia in Canada. And the paper was published in Psychopharmacology. And basically, they showed that symptoms dramatically improved after just one treatment of MDMA coupled with psychotherapy compared to a group of people who received MDMA but a lower dose, or another group who only received psychotherapy. And so that sort of the full dose of MDMA coupled with psychotherapy was substantially effective. And then after 2 sessions, over half of the participants would no longer have met the criteria that are used to diagnose PTSD. So that's just after 2 sessions, which is pretty remarkable. And so excitingly, and I'll get to psilocybin in just a second, but excitingly, there are already going to be 2 more clinical trials focused on MDMA in the near future, and which are distributed across 15 different sites in the United States, Canada, and Israel. And each of those studies will recruit between 100 and 150 participants. And the first one has already started recruiting in November of last year, 2018. Now, okay, so, I say all this about MDMA because, first of all, these are not the same drugs. MDMA, some people call it ecstasy or used to call it ecstasy or Molly. And psilocybin, which is kind of like the active ingredient. It's really one of the active ingredients of psychedelic magic mushrooms. They're not the same drug. However, they do share a couple properties, pharmacological properties, that make it so that our observations of MDMA may yield some insights as to whether or not other kind of, let's say, obscure or maybe taboo drugs might have some utility in psychiatric settings, and that is their effects on the serotonergic system, or the serotonin-associated system. So MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, has a very potent effect at elevating the release of serotonin. It also binds serotonin receptors. Psilocybin, much like essentially all psychedelic hallucinogens, also elevates serotonin signaling and binds a particular serotonergic receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor. It binds the other ones as well, but more so the 5-HT2A receptor. I don't want to bring up words like avidity or potency or efficacy, but regardless, they share this effect on the serotonin signaling system. And so depending upon what it is about the pharmacology of MDMA that's rendered it to be effective, evidently, in these past few clinical trials, effective in the treatment of PTSD, if it is its effects on the serotonin signaling system, then perhaps psilocybin may yield some benefits as well. And given the fact that they're not identical, pharmacologically speaking, perhaps people that don't respond favorably to MDMA for whatever reason, perhaps it's more stimulating and it does elevate catecholamine signaling more so than psilocybin does. Catecholamine signaling includes dopamine and norepinephrine, which can be rather aversive in some people. Psilocybin doesn't necessarily do that. So yeah, I mean, if I were to completely speculate, and again, this is total speculation, I would suspect that, yeah, psilocybin might be beneficial for the treatment of PTSD. There have been some studies, by the way, evaluating the efficacy of psilocybin in the treatment of kind of like the psychology associated with end-of-life conditions, like terminal cancer, for example, showing that it is remarkably effective for those conditions. Why not PTSD as well? That isn't so specific to end-of-life cancer patients. So, great topic. Take meds for depression. Do you always have to take them, or will it fix the chemical imbalance? Rai to fly. Excellent topic. So that term, chemical imbalance, has been one that has been used for a very long time, and it had been used so widely within the biomedical community, several decades ago, that it kind of penetrated into popular culture, and it became the way that people understood psychiatric conditions. Depression is just a chemical imbalance, and this is partly a byproduct of the fact that that era of psychiatry and neuroscience was very focused on neurotransmitter levels. These days, we don't focus so much or exclusively on neurotransmitter levels because we have newer technologies that enable us to focus more on distribution of neurons. What is the circuit of neurons doing? And neurotransmitter levels is just one character in the play, right? It's just one part of what's going on. And so all of this to say that if you're diagnosed with depression and you're taking medications to treat that depression or to assist in treating that depression, the medication in and of itself isn't the ideal cure, because depression isn't just a chemical imbalance, right? A chemical imbalance or neurotransmitter levels are a part of the story. And that is how an SSRI like fluoxetine or Prozac can be beneficial. But rather, depression arises from a pattern of neuronal activity, specific neurons within your brain communicating with other specific neurons in your brain in such a way as to generate all the symptoms of depression. And make no mistake, depression is a biological condition. I think that goes, helps us to understand why antidepressant medications haven't been as effective as we would have hoped, because it's more complicated than just serotonin levels. If it was just if your serotonin levels were the only thing that determined whether or not somebody's depressed, then we would have cured it already. And so now, is it necessary to take them? That is really a decision that you ought to put in the hands of a psychiatrist who's trained to manage and help you manage depression, right? Do you always have to take an antidepressant to treat depression? No, certainly not. But for some people, it can make a massive difference in your quality of life and in the frequency of things like suicidal ideation, suicidality. Rates, I've said it, I think, before in this conversation, but rates of suicide are increasing in the United States. And so this is not a trivial matter. And so, if your psychiatrist is recommending you take this medication, definitely follow his or her guidance. But hopefully also you have access to psychotherapy as to combine with the pharmacological treatment. Okay, I'm way behind. Xanax is poison and ruins your brain. Do not take. Sweet Susan. So Xanax is alprazolam, as I'm sure many of you are aware. It is actually not a GABAergic agonist. More specifically, it's a positive allosteric modulator. Who cares what that word means or what that phrase means? What it does is it binds to GABA receptors and makes them more sensitive to GABA. When GABA, the neurotransmitter that your brain generates, binds its GABA receptor, if a benzodiazepine like alprazolam is present, it'll sort of crank up its sensitivity a little bit, or it'll make that response even greater. Now, Xanax used to be one of the most widely prescribed drugs in the United States. I don't know how it compares worldwide, but for a long time, it was a kind of go-to medication for a variety of conditions. By the way, I can't remember if it's Xanax or Valium in particular. These are very similar drugs. Really, the only difference is how the duration of their effect and how quickly they begin, their effects. Were made by many of the same pharmaceutical companies that have now been implicated in the opioid overdose epidemic. Just as a side note, to sort of buttress the point you were making. But because it was so widely prescribed, the biomedical community kind of quickly recognized that this is a non-trivial withdrawal syndrome, right? People form chemical dependencies to benzodiazepines extraordinarily rapidly. That's true for opioids, that's true for alcohol, right? But when it comes to both benzodiazepines and alcohol, by the way, but benzodiazepines is the topic here, the withdrawal syndrome, when somebody's been taking Xanax for a long time, alprazolam for a long time, their brain has become accustomed to the presence of that drug. It has adjusted its own levels of GABA signaling and glutamate signaling, or the, let's say the off signal versus the on signal. And then when you withdraw the drug from that system, you undergo a withdrawal syndrome, just like people who are trying to quit smoking do or trying to quit drinking do. The difference, however, with benzodiazepines is that withdrawal syndrome is potentially life-threatening because you can potentially exhibit seizures that damage neurons. And so, I certainly wouldn't call it a poison, as Paracelsus, the sort of father of modern toxicology, said in, I believe, Swedish or Swiss, I think actually Swiss. The difference between a poison and a medication is dose. And that's certainly true for benzodiazepines. I mean, you're right, they have this potential threat given chemical dependence, but they also can make a massive difference between the loss of neurons following a seizure amongst, in somebody who's having a seizure either via epilepsy or for whatever reason, and then going through the seizure and coming out the other side relatively unscathed. It can also help very significantly if somebody's admitted to the hospital with psychosis. So, these are useful tools, right? I mean, a hammer is a very useful tool, but it's also potentially dangerous, right? In the wrong hands, in the wrong context. So, beautiful paintings. Thank you very much. They've been in my family for a very long time. I can remember colors. How can this be proved? Success without college. I can remember colors. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. However, it is certainly the case that there is a wide variation among different individuals with regards to, first of all, visual perception and visual memory, and our ability to visualize anything. So, for example, this was a paper that came out relatively recently, I believe last year, the middle of last year, from a group at Cambridge, if I remember correctly, that basically showed that they have like a term for it, but anyways, it turns out that some people are incapable of truly visualizing anything, right? And so I happen to be one of those people. When I was playing sports, I remember coaches would say something like, visualize the shot. Or, people would ask, whenever they asked me, like, visualize a butterfly landing in your hand. I would assume that they just meant, like, pretend like a butterfly is landing in your hand. And I could do that, right? I could pretend, there's some butterflies behind me there. I could pretend that I know what it would look like if their little, pointy little feet were on my hand. I could feel maybe the little tickle. I could imagine their wings flapping this way and that. But that's it. There's zero visual experience. Well, to my chagrin, to my surprise, it turns out that some people can literally have a visual experience, which strikes me as being a lot like a hallucination. But they literally have a visual experience where they can see a butterfly in their hand. And evidently there's some range in just how, if let's say, potent that visualization is. And, immediately I was like, are you kidding me? Like, people can actually, it strikes me as having like a superpower. But so I went to all of my friends in the lab, and then some of my friends outside of my lab who also have backgrounds in science and medicine, and I was like, all right, I didn't give them any of that preliminary intro, right? And I just asked them, like, again, imagine a butterfly on your hand on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being you literally see as though it were there, a butterfly in your hands, 1 being 0, zilch, not a visual experience, which is what I have. And I asked them, and there was pretty substantial variation. And then, after they gave me it's a 5, dude, totally a 5. I'd be like, okay, wait, let's talk about this. Like, when I say 5, I mean, if there were a butterfly in your hand, you would not be able to distinguish between your visualization of the butterfly and the real butterfly. They're like, yeah, dude, totally see it. Mind blowing. Okay, so all of that to say, one's ability to remember things like colors or experiences or environments, right? Contexts in which things happen, or phone numbers, or blah, all the various things that we can commit to memory to varying degrees of efficacy. That varies quite widely. And so if well, oh gosh, I could go on and on, like, prosopagnosia, for example, where there's variations in people's ability to visualize or remember, understand people's faces. And so, yeah, I mean, it is not, I don't know how you could prove it, though, frankly. That strikes me as extraordinarily difficult to study, particularly if you don't have access to, like, neuroimaging technology. Okay, you are calling from a 940 area code. What's your name and where are you calling from?
You're gay.
Cool, dude. Good one. All right. What concentration does DMT have on the pineal gland, coltimus prime? All right. I love... aphantasia. Thank you, Euro. So evidently I have difficulties just remembering words that I literally spent like days reading articles about. But anyways, Euro does not suffer from that. Okay, so... to what levels does DMT, dimethyltryptamine, accumulate in the pineal gland? Now, that topic, that sentence, assumes quite a bit. First of all, it assumes that dimethyltryptamine is produced in the brain. It also assumes that dimethyltryptamine is produced in the pineal gland, and it also assumes that DMT accumulates at levels that are significant enough to be meaningful, right? Now, let's talk about how valid and invalid those assumptions are. First of all, it is true. Now, so first of all, the theory that DMT plays some kind of important role in the brain is derived from speculation, educated speculation, but it's speculation nonetheless, by somebody who wrote a book called The Spirit Molecule named Rick Strassman. I can't remember when. I believe it was the late 90s, mid-90s perhaps. It might have been in the 70s. Might have been long before that. But regardless, he had a background in science, and there had indeed been studies that showed that dimethyltryptamine can be detected at trace levels in the brain. Now, you can detect levels of dopamine, you can detect levels of serotonin, you can detect levels of melatonin in the brain, right? But all of those neurotransmitters accumulate at concentrations. The numbers of molecules that accumulate of those different neurotransmitters is at a level that represents a substantial role in neuronal activity. Dimethyltryptamine, those would not be collected at trace levels. Dimethyltryptamine, which is as you can tell from the structure of its name, is a modification of the tryptamine molecule. And if you were to compare the dimethyltryptamine molecule to serotonin, you would probably, particularly if you don't have any background in chemistry, you'd probably find it a little bit difficult to distinguish the two. They're very, very similar. Tryptophan is an amino acid precursor to serotonin and is converted enzymatically within the brain into serotonin. And, it would only take a couple of enzymatic modifications of serotonin to become dimethyltryptamine, or melatonin to become dimethyltryptamine. So theoretically, it's possible. However, it's never been detected at greater than trace levels. And then in particular, when it comes to the pineal gland is a really minuscule part of the brain. It is a very evolutionarily ancient part of the brain, I should say. And again, primitive is what we might call it in phylogeny or evolutionary biology. And we say that because if you go, other primates, we're a primate. There are other primates. If you evaluate the brains of chimpanzees and bonobos, they have a pineal gland. But even if you go to simpler organisms like mice and rats, they have a pineal gland. Certainly cats and dogs have one. And then you can even go simpler and simpler, and there's something like a pineal gland in things like reptiles. And intriguingly, in reptiles, what is likely their equivalent of our pineal gland actually does have the anatomy of something that could have theoretically evolved into an eye. And in fact, in some lizards, it is at a location where it is indeed photosensitive, right? It's not functioning identical to an eye. It's not generating a visual experience, but it is affecting neuronal activity as a function of received light stimulation, okay? And so if you look at the pineal gland within the human brain, its anatomy, certainly more so than like the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex, does kind of look like what might have originated as something that could have become an eye. It's round, it's very small. It is sort of right at the top of the thalamus, but it is very, very simple anatomically. It's not remotely as complex or diverse in its function as again, structures like the hippocampus, or, the thalamus, or, the nucleus accumbens, which is very important for addiction, also very evolutionarily primitive. And so, or even the brain structures that I study, the interpeduncular nucleus and the medial habenula. The medial habenula, I should say, again, a structure that I study, very near and dear to my heart, by some neuroanatomists, perhaps originated as the stalk of the pineal gland. So I am not one to denigrate the importance of the pineal gland, but largely speaking, the role that it plays is in helping to coordinate our circadian rhythm. Now, okay, so DMT is not found at levels that are significant in the brain. There's no evidence, none, that suggests that DMT plays any role in dreams or in near-death experiences. And frankly, we can explain dreams, near-death experiences, déjà vu, all of these kind of interesting, quirky psychological states without needing to invoke a psychedelic hallucinogen to understand why they happen and how they happen. So I know that was a long comment. I haven't talked about that in a long time. Okay, is it a crystal? No, so the pineal gland is, okay, we do have things that are like crystals in our nervous system, but they're not like the crystals that I have, behind me, like amethyst and quartz and so on. They are little bits of shell, calcium carbonate, sort of like, a seashell, little nuggets that are hosted in our vestibular organs, and they are what enable us. They give us that additional sensory system, that sixth sense, if you may, or if you will, that a lot of people forget to acknowledge. That enables us to be sensitive to acceleration, to where we are relative to gravity. Like, how do I know that direction is down relative to my head? It's because these little crystal, rocky type things are literally moving within my vestibular system, tickling hair cells that are a lot like those that enable us to hear. No, the pineal gland, in terms of it as a tissue, as an anatomical structure, is a lot like, a lot like any other brain structure. It's composed of neurons, of, glial cells, the other type of brain cell that people don't usually talk about quite as much. Fats, membranes, proteins, neurotransmitters, melatonin. So yeah, it's not like some kind of abnormal crystal that's present in our brain. Okay. Did you know you can catch an STD in the brain? Certainly. Okay. Do you think you're smart? I don't think I'm any smarter than anybody here. Not remotely. Okay. I'm new to your broadcast. I have a question. Oh, well, Johnny does it. Well, I'd be happy to do my best to see if I have anything insightful to say about it. Okay. DMT injection was a method used in the study. Yes, there have been some studies that did that. Learn something before you tell me to leave clueless one. Oh, it's cool. Whatever. People are interested in different topics. No big deal. Okay. Oh, sorry, folks. What is a brain scientist? Excellent topic. It seems kind of simple, right? But there are some distinctions. Most people, I think, in society are familiar with the science of the brain through medicine, right? So neurologists and perhaps neurosurgeons. Those folks are trained to interact, to confront, to manage the brain via the medical arts, right? Science and medicine are not the same thing. In fact, they didn't emerge at the same time. Medicine is a much older discipline than science, modern science at least. And it was only relatively recently in human history that medicine became, or certain domains of medicine became evidence-based, which essentially means science-based. It wasn't always that way. It used to be what you might call eminence-based, where, this physician has been a physician for 40 years, and usually he has seen everything, right? Now these days, you have to prove it if you're going to use some kind of treatment, right? So the more sort of common or formal term for the discipline in which I work, or of which I am a member, is neuroscience. However, because people outside of the United States, people who speak different languages, they don't always use the term neuroscience. It's not as communicative a term. Brain science is what it is, or it is what I do. Neuroscience encompasses, of course, the entire nervous system. But what is it that distinguishes training in science versus training in medicine? Of course, we oftentimes memorize the same things. We all have to go through organic chemistry. We all have to go through, cellular biology, molecular biology, and so on. But to be the training of a scientist is to use the scientific method to ask questions, perform experiments, and try to come to some kind of conclusion, to contribute back to the human fund of knowledge. Medicine, some physicians will engage in that endeavor, but the goal of medicine is to reduce human suffering, right? It's to recognize a condition and apply, at least these days, whatever treatment has statistically been the most successful. And so the relationship between science, a brain scientist and a neurologist, is that we are trying to understand more about the biology, about the nature of the human brain and consciousness, and then arm physicians, medical doctors, with better information to generate better treatments. Okay. You didn't see my message. Oh, but you're very kind. Okay, so Johnny does it. I will try and check it out. I've been trying to ask a question answered in your last 3 scopes. I'm sorry, West NYC guys. So by the way, you can always tweet at me, right? _anthropoid. You can DM me if you don't want to talk about it in public. No problem. Okay. I'm trying to see. Johnny, can human consciousness transfer to a digital device? Is that possible? I love it. I'm glad I saw it. So first of all, I should say I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. The only reason I say that now is that is a topic that we talked about in depth using one of Elon Musk's many companies, Neuralink, as the kind of basis for the conversation. The goal of that company is to develop something called a whole brain computer interface, meaning some kind of interface between computers that interacts with enough of the brain as to enable very high throughput or very simple communication between the computer and the brain. The motivation for this, by the way, is the anticipation of human intelligence being surpassed by artificial intelligence in the imminent future. Okay. Now, is it theoretically possible? Let's start there. It's more fun. Yes, absolutely. So consciousness arises out of the brain. It is what the brain produces. And the brain, activities in the brain between neurons and glial cells and so on, neurotransmitters, they all follow the laws of physics, right? As of yet, we have yet to discover any aspect of consciousness that does not obey the laws of physics. And so as a result, computers certainly are bound by the laws of physics. And we certainly understand them better than we understand our brain. Hello from Italy. I work for somebody from Italy, from northern Italy. So yes, theoretically, if we could, the only gap between our ability to have the brain interact with computers in a very comprehensive way is knowledge, right? We still have to gain more knowledge, but importantly, we should say there are brain-computer interfaces that exist today. So, for example, if you suffer from Parkinson's disease, one potential treatment is the implantation of an electrode stimulator, deep brain stimulation. That is, generally speaking these days, connected to a computer that will deliver a modulated dose of electrical current into the part of the brain that's damaged by Parkinson's disease, called the substantia nigra. It's a very deep dopamine-producing part of the brain that progressively deteriorates in Parkinson's disease. And so there's a computer that is helping to modulate your own brain activity to optimize it so that you don't have tremors. And if you've never seen this, I highly recommend you check it out. Go on YouTube and type in, Parkinson's deep brain stimulation or Parkinson's electrical or electrode implant, and you will see very, poignantly demonstrated that when they turn off their brain-computer interface, their tremors begin almost immediately. And then when they turn it back on, and they can have difficulty turning it back on because of those tremors, they abate almost just as quickly. It's very remarkable. It's, I think, one of the most powerful demonstrations of the relationship between, neurons and behavior. So theoretically, it's certainly possible. However, to develop an effective whole brain-computer interface, there are different numbers that are used, but generally speaking, there is a threshold of the number of neurons with which that interface, that device implanted somehow, is capable of interacting. So in other words, it has to be able to listen to enough of your brain to not only receive signals from your brain, but decipher them and deliver them to a computer to generate some kind of meaningful interaction. And we are very far from whatever that threshold is. Some say 1 million, some say 10 million. These days, at most, we are, around a couple dozen. So, but given the rate of technological development, could very well be the case that sooner than even somebody in my position would anticipate, we'll develop some kind of brain-computer interface that'll help me stop that. But yeah, if you're interested in a deeper dive into the topic of a little bit of artificial intelligence, but more brain-computer interfaces, the integration of technology and computers into the brain, check out the podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, and all the various platforms. Okay, I have a feeling there's something very wrong with my mother's brain. What do I do? Well, Jackie, go to your physician. Hopefully you have like a primary care physician. Go to that person and say, hey, we have this concern. They will either, if they can just recognize it, they'll help treat it, or they will refer you to a specialist, usually a neurologist, who will then leverage some of the technologies that we have available to evaluate what's going on in her brain and see if maybe there's been something like a stroke, or maybe little mini strokes called transient ischemic attacks, or something else, or if it has nothing to do with the brain, maybe it has something to do with something else. But that's the pathway. You go to your primary care physician or any general practitioner of medicine, and then they'll make a referral. So it's just like a lobotomy. I know lobotomies were the best medical cure of history. Certainly not. And they are not really used these days. By the way, I should say, lobotomies were not an innovation that came out of neuroscience. Those were psychologists or psychiatrists who attempted to use lobotomies, just in defense of my discipline. All right, so I believe we have somebody calling in. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, Ian. My name is Gregory. I'm calling from Washington State.
Oh, yeah, I recognize you, Gregory. What's on your mind?
Well, basically, there's all these people and the personal injuries and just stuff sometimes. But I wanted to know basically that when somebody has like a TBI, I think it's called, or something, why that does something like effects to people. Like sometimes I learned from the show, Young and the Restless, that sometimes for brain tumors or TBIs that somebody can have violent episodes or something, but I don't really understand completely why that would happen and stuff.
Yeah, so TBIs, traumatic brain injury, that is a sort of a whole collection of insults that occur to the brain, right? So a concussion is probably the most well-known or well-accepted version of a TBI that people experience, but you don't have to have a concussion to have a TBI. So why is it that after having a traumatic brain injury, various things about consciousness or behavior or emotion change? Well, depending upon where in the brain, what part of the brain has been affected physically by the injury, right? Is it more forebrain regions? Is it more temporal regions? Or is it, posterior regions? You'll have different symptoms. And so oftentimes you'll get a kind of consistent set of symptoms. So things like impulse control problems, aggression, depression, bipolar disorder, maybe addiction to, sort of arising out of a self-medication behavior, impulsivity, things like gambling, or risky sexual behavior, a variety of things. Aggression is perhaps one of the more notorious, particularly given the experiences of a lot of professional football players in the United States. But essentially why is because when you have a traumatic brain injury, whether it's a concussive one or not, if you could imagine your brain as being sort of like Jell-O, right? Like if, from like the 1950s when people just had like a big mound of Jell-O that they'd serve. If you could imagine just sort of like tapping with your finger on the side of the Jell-O, you would see a little ripple, right, pass through the Jell-O fairly rapidly, but, it would move. Now, if you, tap hard enough, you're going to have that Jell-O will begin to rupture, right? And so obviously the brain is not identical to Jell-O, but it is very, very fragile. I think most people have the concept of a concept of the brain being fairly like resilient and structurally sound. But that's because, generally speaking, if you've ever seen a brain, it's undergone something called fixation, where everything is sort of locked into place. In reality, if you were, and you can probably find a video of somebody just holding a non-fixed brain, it's very, very fragile. And if, in fact, if you just let it sit on like a table, it'll just begin to collapse. And so if you could imagine, our brain is floating in a bath of cerebral spinal fluid, and that in part helps to dampen, the brain's movement when we accelerate, but it can only do so much. At a certain acceleration, at a certain G level, the brain is going to bump up against the skull, and a pressure wave is going to transfer through the brain, just like that wave through the jello. And if it's strong enough, what can happen is either neurons, the membranes of neurons rupture, killing those neurons, or perhaps more commonly, the connections between neurons, axons, the integrity of their membranes, very similar to the integrity of neuronal membranes, or neuronal cell body membranes, they can rupture. And that, a very important part of neuronal biology is keeping the outside out and the inside in, only letting certain things pass through. And if you just break the membrane, then that control is totally lost. And then you can have, those neurons can begin to die, or the connections between neurons can begin to die. And depending upon what's connected to what, where that injury occurred, that TBI occurred, you can have different symptoms. But generally speaking, it's just because there has been damage caused to a specific or a constellation of brain regions.
So, like, when you have, like, well, not exactly like a TBI or something, but when you have, like, an internal growth at times and stuff, I'm told that also, that also affects, stuff. But, like I said, I'm trying because, not everybody, has TBI or gets fallen down and has seizures and stuff, but it's weird.
In fact, I mean, so Greggy, you bring up, a growth in the brain also affecting behavior, and you're 100% right. And in fact, one of my favorite examples, or I think a very effective example of how changes in the anatomy of the brain, either through injury or through the growth of a tumor, affects behavior, is a case that is pretty widely studied in biology these days. Back, a couple decades ago, there was a shooting at the University of Texas at Austin, where a guy who I believe was an engineer climbed to the top of the clock tower and began just randomly shooting people with his rifle, and was eventually taken out by the cops. And when they evaluated who this guy was and why he did it, they went to his house and found that the night before he had murdered both his mother and his wife. And he also left a note saying, "I don't understand these aggressive impulses that I'm experiencing. There's like a beast inside of me. And if the worst happens, then please, I hope somebody will study my brain." And they did. And guess what they found? There was a very large growth, a very large growth adjacent to the amygdala. Now, we can't know for sure if it was the tumor that was responsible for impinging upon his consciousness, promoting these types of aggressive behaviors. Given its location, it would be unsurprising if it were. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are multiple cases, I could go on and on, of various violent acts that have been associated with aberrant anatomy. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I'm just trying to ask. I guess I'm just trying to ask. Like I said, and maybe I'm not understanding. Why would something, or why would one of these grows or whatever, make these effects and stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's fair enough. So if you could imagine, right, we have 86 billion neurons, about, several trillion connections between those neurons. And there's a wide variation in where each of our 86 billion neurons are and to which other neurons our neurons are communicating, right? We all don't have identical brains. In fact, even identical twins will have slightly different brains. But all of those neurons do something, right? And generally speaking, if you impinge upon the activities of some of those neurons, whatever those responsibilities, whatever those functions of those neurons are also going to be affected. And so who knows if the tumor in Charles Whitman's brain affected amygdalar signaling, resulting in hyperactivity or hypoactivity, causing him to experience abnormal aggression, or if he just also happened to have a tumor, right? We can't know for sure, but it is certainly uncontroversial to say that if you are, significantly modifying somebody's neuronal anatomy, either by an injury, like through a concussion or a TBI, or through the growth of a large-sized tumor, you will have you might be able to be able to predict the consequences in how their behavior and emotion and consciousness changes. But anyways, it's great to talk to you again, Greg. I hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Greg from Washington. All right. So yeah, Charles Whitman. Yeah, that was actually a couple years ago. I led a weekly recitation. I think 2 times a week. I can't remember. Recitation of undergrads, this was like an introductory neuroscience class, and the first meeting that we had, I introduced, just sort of want to introduce myself, tell them what I studied and the kind of work that I do, show some pretty images that I've taken with a microscope. But then I also went through some of these examples of abnormal psychology that have a neuroscientific explanation. And, that's one of the go-to ones, at least for me. Frankly, it's rather tragic, of course. But it just goes to show you that the connection between brain activity, neuronal activity, and behavior and consciousness and emotion is a direct one, right? The mind arises from the brain. Hello from Praha. What do you think about parallel universes? Well, I'm sorry to say that my training doesn't really prepare me to competently talk about parallel universes. However, there are some things that occur within human consciousness that sometimes are attempted to be explained, or some people attempt to explain them by invoking parallel universes, my favorite of which being déjà vu. So I remember a couple years ago, déjà vu was like one of the main things that would come up regularly when people would talk about, interesting things about consciousness. And at that time, there actually was not a ton of research into déjà vu. We didn't thoroughly understand it. However, now, these days, we have a pretty good explanation for déjà vu that doesn't need to invoke spooky physics. If you're interested in déjà vu, by the way, I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird. It's on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play and Anchor and so on. And we talk quite a bit about déjà vu. I didn't expect it to be all that interesting, but it's actually very interesting. So here's just an example where, we don't need a parallel universes to explain déjà vu. It just so happens that some folks with epilepsy whose seizures arise from a particular part of the brain. Epilepsy is a condition where there's aberrant neuronal activity. Neurons are firing impulses at frequencies and durations that are unusual. And oftentimes we observe a seizure as a convulsive seizure, where people can't control the contractions of their muscles. But that is just one category of epileptic seizures. There's also another one where that aberrant neuronal activity emerges from the medial temporal lobe, which is right about here. And it turns out that some significant proportion of those patients whose seizures arise from that brain region experience profound, recurrent, inescapable déjà vu. And it also turns out that if you stimulate that same region of the brain with an electrode during brain surgery, you can induce déjà vu. So all this to say, oftentimes when people are turning to parallel universes or the membrane theory of the universe, where membranes are bouncing up against each other, generally speaking, we have a much simpler and more effective, a more parsimonious, as we say in science, explanation for that aspect of consciousness. But I love that topic. Stop killing the magic, Doc. Wait, how is that not magical, right? How is it not magical that out of this messy anatomical structure, 86 billion neurons, and if you were to sit down, if somebody said, okay, I want you to engineer an engine of consciousness, you would never design it like the human brain. The human brain is wonderful. It's amazing. Its versatility, particularly, is unprecedented on Earth. But it is extraordinarily messy. I mean, you have neurons battling each other for signal dominance. You have redundant systems. You have the messy projections. Where, just to give you an example, like the human eye. Okay, there are several dozen versions of eyeballs, or just eyes, visual systems that are sensitive to photons, right? Our system is designed where we have photoreceptors that are sensitive to certain wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrum, right? The reason that you can see there's a little bit of sort of aquamarine color there, I'm not sure, and sort of yellowish color there is that different photoreceptors are being stimulated by photons that are emerging from your device and splashing up against your retina. However, those photoreceptors, you would think, given that the light is coming from out there, would be pointing out there, right? You'd think the photoreceptors would be receiving light like that. No. In the human eye, they're pointed in the opposite direction. So photons have to go through the goopy, stuff of your eyeball, bounce up against the back of your eye, and then hit the photoreceptors for you to be aware of them. That's just one example of just super messy, biology. But that's how evolution works, right? Just because, human consciousness is amazing and comprehensive as it is, it was just good enough, right? The emergence of human intelligence didn't interfere with our ability to reproduce. And in fact, it probably gave us some reproductive advantages, but it's extraordinarily expensive and it's not perfect, right? We're not rational. We're not truly rational creatures. We do irrational things all the time, and violent things and horrendous things, but also wonderful things. And out of all of that comes from this messy 3-pound mass of protein and fat, essentially. And to me, that's pretty amazing. Okay. Are women more intelligent than men? Okay, so so first of all, no. But nor are men necessarily more intelligent than women. A woman can be more intelligent than a man, but it totally depends upon how you're defining intelligence. And it's important to note that, you're talking to somebody who's wrapping up my PhD in neuroscience, right? So I care about the brain, the biology of the brain, in understanding the various aspects of our consciousness that we care about. In particular, I study mood, aversive mood, in particular, through the lens of understanding addiction. Intelligence, the study of intelligence, predates modern neuroscience. And so it's sort of this independent discipline that's it's still active, but it kind of engages the topic in parallel to psychology. It is a domain of psychology, but parallel to other domains of psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. And so as a result, they have defined a lot of things about intelligence that, using only the tools that were at their disposal before we had all the wonderful tools of neuroscience. And so as a result, you have to define what you mean by intelligent. Do you mean somebody's IQ score? In which case, I think that's a very bad definition of intelligence. It's certainly it encompasses a very important part of intelligence, perhaps the majority of human intelligence, but not its entirety. And so, you will continue to see studies that come out year after year where people find a significant consistent difference in intelligence levels between various populations of people. But broadly speaking, it's extraordinarily contextually dependent. It depends on, my favorite example is Albert Einstein had a very unique brain. In fact, anatomically, some neuroanatomists suggest he had a very, very unique brain such that he actually lacked, if you look at a picture of the brain, there's all these wrinkles, right? Gyri and sulci, or gyri and sulci. The valleys are little, sulci. There is one, and we generally speaking have all the same, pretty similar distribution of those wrinkles, right? One of them is called the Sylvian fissure, right? And that's sort of a sulcus that distinguishes the rest of the brain from the temporal lobe. And there are some neuroanatomists that have looked at Albert Einstein's brain, which, by the way, Albert Einstein's brain was stolen after he died, and it was missing for many years, sitting under somebody's desk for many years. Anyways, actually, if you live in Philadelphia, you come to Philadelphia, you can see, it's one of the few places where you can actually see parts of Albert Einstein's brain. But if you look at where his distribution, the anatomy of his brain, it turns out that he seems to be missing the Sylvian fissure. Now, there's not a consensus among neuroscientists that that's the case. Also, frustratingly, because of how his brain was handled after he died, it was not preserved. It wasn't preserved nearly as well as I preserved my brain tissue, right? So it's kind of tough to use for these purposes. But all this to say, he had a very unique brain regardless, right? Indisputable genius. So let's say you took his brain and then put it into a human who was born 500 years earlier in, the steppes of Mongolia, or whatever, some completely different context where he didn't have the opportunity to study math or physics, spoke a completely different language, was, grew up under completely different cultural contexts and necessities for survival and, cultural expectations of him. we probably wouldn't have at least Albert Einstein's insights regarding relativity, right? And so that's why, I think it's important. I know yes, a fairly simple topic, but differences in intelligence, it's a very fraught topic. It's very poorly studied by a lot of people. And, you really need to define your terms. I'll just end with this. I think one of the best scientists studying intelligence right now, the relationship between genetics and intelligence, is a scientist named Elliot Tucker Drob. I believe he's at Emory, the last time I checked. Check out his work. I think it's the most comprehensive. It integrates, so many different disciplines, and he does that on purpose. And I think it's really good work. Okay. His corpus callosum was different as well. Is that right? I don't recall that. Hey, Dennis R. Hands from North Carolina. I thought, Dennis, you were in Florida. Anyways, if you're interested in astronomy, Dennis R. Hands is an instructor of astronomy, and he's a very fun guy. So check him out. And of course, Euromaestro. If you're not familiar with Euromaestro, he is the maestro of Euro. But he gives you tours of various beautiful places, particularly in Paris. Sometimes he moves though, so check him out too. And I should say, I have a podcast called Wired to be Weird, where I talk about everything from déjà vu to drug addiction to dreams to dementia. And those are just the D's. And it's on Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher and so on. Okay, somebody's calling in. Ooh, okay. We're getting called by somebody who looks like they have their own podcast. So the Ears Blood podcast? Oh no, looks like they hung up. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were waiting too long. Feel free to call back in. It sounds like it'd be interesting to talk to you. What do you think of fentanyl? Okay, more fentanyl after this. So, the Ears Blood podcast, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so I guess I can just call you by your podcast title name, but where are you calling from?
I'm California.
From California. I used to live there.
Brains, yeah.
So what's on your mind?
Huh?
What's on your mind?
Okay, I had a question about, you know how, like, neuroscience has come such a long way recently because of the whole, just like neuroplasticity and stuff like that is now, like, such a big deal.
Sure.
Is it as big of a deal as it is seeming to be? Like, if you're, because I know that experiences make, grooves in our brain, right? And the patterns that we do the most make those grooves deeper. Am I right?
Sort of. I mean, you have the right idea, but I'll clarify after you're done.
Okay, so, like, if we want to change the way that we are functioning in the world, we need to then do what?
Okay. So first of all, so neuroplasticity, it is a critical thing that the brain does. But really, it's not like a capability that you can learn, right? It's just automatically happening under the hood. You don't even know it's happening. But without neuroplasticity is the way that we indeed learn from experience. But it's also the way that we develop things like drug addictions. And so when you say, our experience causes there to be grooves in the brain, that's not quite the case. But what it does do is it changes the way that neurons are connected to one another and communicate with one another. So, you're not going to see like very dramatic changes in anatomy. The brain is, if you just look at the person's brain over the course of their life, it's, after they've grown up, it's not going to change very much. You won't be able to see with your eyes. It's more at a molecular level and in a circuit level. So, so we're talking about things like how many receptors for a neurotransmitter are present on a neuron, or to which other neurons. We have about 86 billion neurons. Which neurons are they communicating with? That number can change. Okay, so all of that said, now via neuroplasticity, the whole concept of something like psychotherapy, for example, is that you are modifying your brain activity intentionally, sort of on the brain's terms, right? Through the inputs that we evolved to have, our sensory systems and our cognition. And you're absolutely right. One way to think of it is sort of like if you could imagine what happens when, let's say water flows over the side of a mountain. When it starts flowing, no big deal, right? Okay, there's water coming down this mountain. But over the course of, thousands of years, you're going to start to see a big groove in that mountain, kind of similar to what you were talking about. But again, what we're talking about is that, it's the connectivity between our 86 billion neurons and not the overall anatomy of our brain.
Right, exactly. So, like, I was curious to know, because each time you do something that you haven't done before, it's supposed to be healthy for your brain, right? Because it's essentially, instead of having just that one
Sure.
then it's going to make for more options for your brain to fire those neurotransmitters. Right?
Yeah. So you're 100%. It is definitely advantageous. So, when we talk about what is it that predisposes people to developing something like dementia early on, earlier than others,
Right.
You're right that cognitive challenge, presenting the brain with a bunch of new challenges or problems to solve does seem to be therapeutic in at least staving off the onset of dementia in people who are predisposed. And then, interestingly, I was just talking about déjà vu, and it turns out that déjà vu tends to happen more frequently in people who have more novel experiences, like if they travel a lot or something. That's just random little tidbit.
Something